This is Brian, ScreenFiles.com in review. What I'm looking at today is 2020's Midnight Mass, directed by Mike Flanagan. It's a 7-episode series, limited series I should say, currently airing on Netflix. And I've been following the career of Mike Flanagan for quite a while now. And while I didn't like his first feature, he's gone on to do some really impressive work. And what makes his work so good is that he focuses on character first. He has weird happenings going on, typically, in his movies, but it's always based in character. The people in his movies aren't disposable. Everyone has a role to play, and he typically populates his movies with excellent actors, and so everything tends to gel really well. And Midnight Mass is no exception. Though before I begin, there was a tweet from Stephen King, I want to say 7 or 8 days, maybe 10, before Midnight Mass premiered. And I thought that was interesting, because if you recall, Mike Flanagan directed Dr. Sleep, based on the novel by Stephen King, and was in talks to direct Revival, also based on a novel by Stephen King. So this gives me the impression that Mike Flanagan really likes the work of Stephen King. So when watching Midnight Mass, it occurred to me that this is essentially a remake of Salem's Lot. It's virtually identical in terms of story beats, though like what I mentioned earlier, Mike Flanagan brings a humanity and a depth to the characters. At this point, there have been 2 versions of Salem's Lot. One directed by Tobe Hooper, the other directed by Michael Solomon. And the latter is great, by the way. I really like Michael Solomon's version. Though, and while I don't think Midnight Mass is as good as that, it's very close. If you're at all familiar with the story of Salem's Lot, it revolves around a town which is infested by vampires. And Midnight Mass is similar in that respect, exactly the same idea. But it's not a copy. It uses the same story, but it approaches it differently. It's almost like an otherworld's version of Salem's Lot. For instance, in the movie version of Stephen King's story, I read the book, though I read it quite a while ago, so I don't really have much of a memory of it, truth be told. Though in the movie, the vampires came and destroyed a thriving town. In the case of Mike Flanagan's Midnight Mass, it works differently in that the island is already dying. It didn't need vampires to worsen that situation at all. Though there's very little in the way of economic opportunity in this town, only because of an oil spill. They relied on fishing, which destroyed the fishing stock, which meant that it devastated the entire economy, and a lot of people left. One of those people is returning, though the reason why is because he was involved in an auto accident that killed this girl. And what Flanagan does that's really clever is that he misdirects. This man, we probably would assume, is the focus of the story, is devastated by the damage he's done and the life he's taken, and he returns home, if only because he has nowhere else to go. He was in jail for something like 4 years, if I recall, and his life was just upended, and all he has is his home. So he goes back. And as I said, this is a town in decay. The people who relied on fishing can no longer do so, and it's almost frozen in time, but in the worst possible way, which, as I mentioned, is the exact opposite of the approach used in the Stephen King adaptations. Another thing is that, and this kind of bothers me a little about Midnight Mass, is that the word vampire is never used. And there's a reason for that, but it's not a strong enough reason. The vampire is invited to their village by a priest, and the priest thinks that this is an angel, which you may go, that's ludicrous. It's actually not. I've heard prior to this movie that the Bible talks about angels. I'm not a religious person, so I haven't read it myself. Though the Bible talks about angels, and they're described as almost horrific creatures, something that you would not want to see. And when the priest encounters something which, for all intents and purposes, is a vampire, he doesn't call it that. Instead, he calls it an angel. Now keep in mind, when this happens, the priest is not only old, but he's suffering from dementia. So he assumes that this vampire is an angel. For people who don't believe in the reality of such beings, it would make perhaps sense for them to think of it something other than being a voracious predator, and instead something of God. In a sense it is, because we're all creatures of God, I imagine, even the monsters. Though it's essentially invited into the village by the priest, and it begins to turn many of the members of the community. As I said, Midnight Mass is, story-wise, Salem's Lot, but it does more interesting things than both televised versions of it, though. What it does better, I would argue, than most of the television adaptations up to this point, there's another one coming, I don't think it's necessary, but it's coming. It's that the vampire is clearly a menace and a threat to these villagers, but it's not the only threat. And in fact, it could be argued that it's not even the worst threat when all is said and done. And it's these levels of characterization that make Midnight Mass so fascinating. And it's also worth mentioning that it's one of the most terrifying things I've watched in television in literally years. Terrifying not due to its violence, though there is some of that. It's terrifying because, as I keep repeating, Mike Flanagan creates very relatable, very well-written people. They're not just things to fill space. They feel like people. Everyone feels fully fleshed out, even relatively minor characters. And what this has the effect of doing is that it makes what you see on the screen at points very terrifying. This works so well, and it is probably the best adaptation or reboot of a Stephen King property that is technically not an adaptation of a Stephen King property. This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com in review. Do you agree, disagree? Let me know down below. And as usual, consider a like or a follow. Peace.